Thanks for signing up to bring trade. It was so nice not to have to drag in like 50 cartons tonight, so I appreciate it. So we're Wild Ones. This is the Big River, Big Woods chapter of Wild Ones, of course, and attendance is always free. You never have to pay, but if you do join, we appreciate it because it helps support our projects and our speakers and the things that we do here. Plus, then you get the journal that comes in. So, next slide. I always like to put up the additional resources. So we have a website for both national and for us, great information. Facebook, we have a Facebook page, and there are several really good native plant related Facebook pages. And then we're also on Instagram. Crystal Colby does our Instagram page. It does a fabulous job. So Big River, Big Woods on Instagram. Next one. We have several upcoming service projects doing and Roseville clearing some invasives. These are the dates on the front table outside. There is a flyer with the dates. All of them are between 9:30 and 11:30 at these different sites. And it'd be great if you can come help do any invasive clearing. There was one last week, and I think Robin was at that one. We had a good group. Good size group of people. So it just if you can help out, that's great. Next slide. Oh yeah, Wow Walks. Yeah, so we had our first Wow Walk last month. It was so cool. Ice on all the branches, so it was interesting, but it was great. And I got to talk to some people I hadn't met and spent much time with, and there were a few little things. But our next one coming up will be at Como this Sunday from 1 to 3, the Como Woodland Garden. I'd love to see people there. Just a great way. It's very informal. We kind of just go walk around and talk and look and see what we see and sort of share knowledge. And it's just fun. The entire schedule for the year is on the website too. Next page. That's the schedule, but it is on the Big River, Big Woods website too. Next page. Next month, we're going to talk about jumping worms. So we all are excited. I've been looking at my gardens a little bit going, ooh, does that one look okay? No, I haven't seen it yet, but of course, it's something we're all concerned about. So we're going to have a kind of an interesting presentation. We're going to have some discussion about jumping worms. And then we're going to have plants that we're going to show how we can bare root them so that we can safely transplant them into other things. So you'll be able to go home with some plants too next month. We have 3 summer garden tours coming up. Sunday, June 22nd is the Como Park Woodlands Garden. It's going to be a formal tour sponsored by the people at Como. Tuesday, we're going to have this really fun one at Keller. We're going to have little go-karts to drive around in and start golf carts. Yeah. Drive around with. We may end up having a sign up for that so we know how many carts we need to reserve, but the information again will be on the website. That's in July. In August, we're working on finalizing one. It's finalized. Okay.
We're not sure about the time yet.
Okay. And again, always go to our website, bigriverbigwoods.org. And then if you ever want any more information, Joe does a great job on that. Next slide. Oh, plant sale. Got a plant sale coming up. So plant sale coming up. We're looking for volunteers to help with the plant. Yeah, are you volunteering? Our friend, there's a sign up sheet. We just need people to help it's going to be at John Kramer's house. We need to have people there to help when people come pick up their plants. Plants are going to be first come, first serve. So there's no pre-orders this year. We've got a fantastic selection of plants. Erica has put a little flyer out in the front that shows all the plants that are going to be there, and shrubs. There's going to be trees. There's going to be a really nice assortment. So come and get
the best thing about volunteering is you get to see John's garden. He'll do a tour for you. So, well worth volunteering.
Yeah, it's great. Plus you can kind of like pick your plant.
Right, you get
first pick. So I'm going to bring that sign up sheet in and I'll pass it around during the meeting. And so if you can sign up for a little bit of time to come help out with just the plant sale, that would be great. Okay, next slide. Also, Preston Drum from Northern Holler is going to be there. And he's also going to bring plans, and I think you can pre-order plans on his website to pick up at that meeting if you want to as well, so. Oh, and a portion of his sales are actually going to our local chapter, so that's kind of a nice perk that he's doing for us as well. Next slide, tonight, oh, don't forget, I put on everybody's table questions in the box, so if you have some questions you'd like to either about anything, you know, like tonight's discussion or any other things, or you have some ideas for some talks or things you want to do, you know, fill those out, stick them in the box. And then we have the raffle tonight for the book, which is Welcome to Suburbia, which Dale recommended. Oh, there it is. She's modeling it. Stand up and model it, please. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So that's, you can sign up to for the raffle, and we'll do that after we'll let Dale select the winner for this. So, yeah, well.
Yeah.
Tonight's meeting, so tonight, we're excited. I have my little notes here. So Dale grew up in southern Idaho, where he started his lifelong passion for birds and bird conservation. And then fortunately, a significant other, spouse, wife, whatever, brought him to Minnesota. So, but he also spent 15 years in higher education as a professor at the graduate program at the Teton Science Schools in Grand Teton National Park. What a horrible place to have to like spend time. He must have really suffered. Yeah, really suffered with that. But also at the University of Northwestern in St. Paul, teaching community ecology and conservation biology. Currently, he's the director of conservation for Audubon Upper Mississippi River, overseeing avian conservation and science work in Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri. And while we often think about, you know, all the big park reserve and parks and birds, we're finding that all of our little yards are also very important for bird conservation. So tonight he's going to talk about some of those discoveries and how we can create bird-friendly communities. Did I get that all right?
That sounds great.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you. And I guess we'll get started and have treats.
All right. You can talk amongst yourselves while I get this presentation shared. Hopefully smooth. Hey, it worked. Oh, can you see that on Zoom?
Oh, no, you're not sharing.
No, I'm not. Oh, that's right. I gotta share the screen and then do it. That's right. You'd think I'd know this stuff by now.
Nobody's talking about this.
Oh, that's fine, because I gotta look over here. I have to look over here to see what I'm doing.
Oh, because that could come back over here, so. Yeah.
Here. Okay, now let me see if. Where am I? I need to. Participants can now see your screen.
Come on, baby.
There we
Okay,
go.
so that's
Okay.
on the screen now.
Back. Cursor back over here again. Hey,
Very good. Awesome.
you can see things over there.
And I can see it here.
All right, it worked. If we can. I'm gonna just see if I can.
See how you're gonna be in the way, but the view they can see is like the presenter's view.
Oh, really? Okay, let me see if I can. Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can swap.
Yeah,
those.
they're seeing this. I see.
Okay, no, that's fine. There we go. Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
all right. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you. It's a delight to have an audience of people that want to talk about birds, because that's one of my favorite things to do. Again, I've been working for Audubon for almost 4 years now, but roughly 25-year career in avian conservation biology, through a professor, through research, through conservation work. And I love talking with people that are interested in the question of like, what can I do in my yard to contribute to this community of people that are trying to do good things for birds? And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I imagine that, goodness, no, just too many levels of. No, that's not a problem. I just, and the slides are not advancing. Oh, there we go.
All right.
I think it's caught up. Audubon, I imagine in this room, most people know that Audubon is a bird conservation organization. You'd be surprised how many people I tell that I work at Audubon and they're like, is that car thing in Germany? Or like, why are you in Minnesota for that? So Audubon is one of the oldest environmental nonprofits in the country. We were formed in 1906 in response to the realization that some bird populations, especially water birds, were crashing in response to people harvesting them to make decorative hats. And they said it's tragic that we're causing populations to decline, maybe to the risk of extinction, to wear things that are in fashion. And so an organization was formed and they said, we're going to take this on, we're going to educate people, we are going to take action, we're going to protect land. And that's grown now to a hemispheric organization. We have Audubon in Central and South America, in addition to the United States. And our mission is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow with science and conservation and community organization. This is important and critical work because science tells us that bird populations are continuing to struggle differently from how they were, in 1906. But a pretty well publicized study was put out in 2019 where a group of scientists collected all the data that we had from Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey and the new ability to monitor birds with things like weather radar and just all the data we could come together that looked at long-term trends. And I said, okay, the data started getting really good in 1970. So we said, what's going on with the birds? And what we found is that since 1970, and in my lifetime roughly, we've lost about a third of the birds in North America, right? We've lost 3 billion birds. So we've got this very noteworthy decline. And so our mission is to, we like the idea of growing populations. In some cases, we're achieving that. Right now, let's just get them stable, right? So we're bending that bird curve. We're all familiar with that from COVID. Let's get things stable and flat so that we can start to make plans for having positive impacts into the future. So this is not just important for birds, people. This is important for people, right? This is important for society, because what's good for birds is good for us. And when bird populations are crashing, probably some canary in the coal mine situation there where things are not ideal for our communities as well. So Audubon's strategic priorities include working on the coasts, working on land, working on rivers and lakes, working on climate issues, and working on what we call bird-friendly communities, which are human-dominated spaces that we share with birds. And so trying to find ways to coexist peacefully so that we can thrive and the birds can thrive and we can thrive together, which is, I think everybody says, absolutely, right? Who wouldn't sign up for that? We want wildlife to thrive in the same places that we do. Those are our goals. And so when we start to look again, beyond just that, oh, we've lost a lot of birds, and we start to look at individual species, we do see that some, even what I think at least of is like common species, are declining. Yellow warbler, which is one of the most widespread warblers in North America, declined by 25%. Common yellow-throated and other widespread warblers declined 38%. Eastern towhee, the Minnesota bird, we've lost half of that population. Interesting, actually, if you look regionally, things in Minnesota are okay. Eastern towhees in the southeastern United States, awful, just really steep decline. So things are not going well down there. Eastern meadowlark, these gets really scary. So grassland birds are declining faster than any other group. So birds that are really picky about their habitat and dependent on native healthy grasslands are declining faster than any other. So we're not going to really dig into that deeply tonight because we're here to talk about our yards and communities, but Audubon and all of our other partners have robust programs, and a lot of that is directed at grassland birds. We've got a conservation ranching program where we work with grass-fed beef producers to graze their cattle like bison and create beautiful grassland habitats, and then encourage people like you to go out and buy your beef from them, and you can enjoy a hamburger that's going to benefit birds. So really cool stuff. Again, we can talk about that later. We don't have time for it tonight. Audubon is also an organization of science. We're not just doing conservation. We're trying to develop better resources, more data interpretation so that we can understand what needs to be done. And in 2017, I think, we published a report called Survival by Degrees, where we modeled avian response to climate change, right? Climate change at different levels, different intensities of temperature switch. And in some cases, we found, some birds were really not affected that much, but most were. And we have now sort of, at least modeled maps of how ranges will shift. And we can use that information to influence our future planning. I was actually just on a meeting this morning with a professor from the University of Wisconsin that's continuing to do similar work, right? Most of our protected areas, state parks, national parks, wildlife management areas and stuff, those are all based off of old ranges of wildlife in Minnesota and North America. And as things shift, one very good question is, are these protected areas still going to accomplish their goal of protecting important habitats? Or do we need to think about new protected areas or moving what's protected, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, look up Survival by Degrees, and you'll get access to those maps. But tonight, again, we're going to talk about these questions, right? The why and the how. And in this room, I suspect that when I start talking about native plants, no one's mind is going to be blown by the idea that native plants are worth targeting your gardening efforts towards, right? That's what Wild Ones is all about, which is why I'm so eager to support what you're working on. But I think it's interesting to spend a little bit more time on the why. I find that quite fascinating because, as we'll see in just a little bit, from a certain perspective, some people think, well, our quarter-acre residential plots are of little to no value to birds because that's not enough room for really good habitat for any of these rare birds, declining birds that are habitat picky. It's just not going to work for them. So why even bother? What's the point? And actually, we'll find there's a very important point. So we'll spend time talking about why. And then once we have it established that it's important that this happens, then we'll talk about how, and we'll talk about native plants and some of that stuff. And I imagine if you've read Doug Tallamy and whatnot, you're going to recognize some of the information that I share. But let's just look at the prevalence of these, our backyard type habitats in North America. Housing density, along with human density, of course, is changing. Here's a map in 1940 of housing units per kilometer squared. Right, so the reds and oranges are very high density, and then the yellows and sort of tan color a little bit lower, and then the green obviously very low density. So here's 1940. Things changed. Here's 1980 in my childhood. Here's a modeled view of what things will look like very shortly from now, right? And that in Eastern North America especially, there's relatively little areas of large continuous blocks of native habitat. Most of it's impacted by us in one form or another. Either it's agriculture, or it's developed for industry or whatever, or it's our backyards, right? And so when we look at eastern forest birds, it's like, oh my goodness, if we want them to have habitat, we better find a way for the places that we inhabit to provide good habitat for them, okay? So these changes then the transition in North America from these large patches, contiguous landscapes of mostly native plants. You hear the anecdotal stories of, oh, a squirrel could jump on a branch in central Minnesota and never have to touch the ground all the way to the East Coast, right? Maybe there's a couple rivers in there they'd have to navigate, but in theory, that's not too crazy of an event hundreds of years ago, which is much more difficult to accomplish now, because those patches of forest have been fragmented again for lots and lots of different reasons. We've got power lines, we've got agricultural fields, we've got transmission lines, we've got everything that we've done to change the landscape. And so these landscape changes are pervasive. About 300 plus million people in North America, and 80% of us live in a house with a yard of some sort, right? Some people live in apartment complexes or whatever, and they don't have their own little patch of heaven to play with. But 80% of us do. And the average size is the size that I have, quarter acre. Right? Size that if you live in the suburbs in the Twin Cities, you live in Roseville or Troyview or Arden Hills or close by, quarter acre lots. We're kind of familiar with that, right? You got your house in the middle and you got a nice little yard in the front and back. But that's not a whole lot of area. It's about, give or take, 600 square feet or 6,000 square feet, including your house, right? So science can tell us, is a quarter acre of whatever it is that you have, let's say native plants. I've been to John's house, and beautiful yard, right, of dominated by a wonderful diversity of native plants. Is that going to attract a bird to breed, right? Some rare bird that's picky about habitat. Well, it probably isn't. Quarter acre plots just don't really work for most birds. And there's all kinds of science and all kinds of situations, locations around the world and around the country where we study, what are they selecting for nesting habitat, breeding habitat. And we all know that for some, that's great, right? I bet you can name them: northern cardinal, American robin, house finch, right? American goldfinch. They're happy to nest in our backyards. They're not habitat specialists. They coexist with us, grackle, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that for most birds, and these are the birds that are declining, those little small patches, they just don't work. They're picky, they're particular. They want, dozens of acres of a beautiful forest with native plants on the understory, not a fraction of an acre, right? And this is kind of the mindset that's led people to think, well, our urban yards are of no value to birds. But to rare birds, right? And I don't mean to undervalue cardinals and robins and stuff. I think they're delightful too. But in bird conservation, I don't pay much attention to them because they don't need attention paid to them. They're doing just fine. So we pay attention to the birds that aren't doing just fine. So what's distinctive here, though, is that we said that's what they need for breeding habitat, right? But we've got lots of other life stages if you're a bird. And where we live in Minnesota, our bird community is fascinating and unique because they're almost all migrants, right? We do have a handful of birds that stick around for the whole year, right? And we got cardinals, and we got woodpeckers and chickadees and nuthatches. So we've got birds to see in the winter. And if you're into traveling a little bit, you could go up to Saxon Bog or northern Minnesota, and you really get some exciting birds to see in the winter, right? And hawk owls and snowy owls and boreal owls and great gray owls and pine grosbeaks and boreal chickadees and well, it's like what you could do that's more fun than going up and seeing those things. But most of the birds that we see in Minnesota are not here in the winter, right? They are long distance migrants, and North America's bird community is unique in that most of our birds are migrants. So let's look at some interesting statistics. And just by the way, if you're curious about this is a fun place to waste some time. 2 years ago, Audubon released this Bird Migration Explorer website. which just has got more information than you could possibly know what to do with, that maps migratory routes of all of the migrant birds in North America. So make your way to the Bird Migration Explorer, and you'll find the time will just fly. But again, our birds are migratory. That's not necessarily true everywhere in the world, because if you know a little something about birds, you know the majority of the birds in the world are not in Minnesota. They're in the tropics, right? So only about 20% of all the birds in the world migrate. Most of them stay still, and that's because most of them aren't in Minnesota. Like they just live in the tropics, right? So if just think, for example, in North America, we've got about 700 species of regularly occurring breeding birds, right? In the country of Colombia, they have 1,200 species of breeding birds, right? A fraction the size of our country and double the species almost. So most birds are not migratory, but in North America, they are. North America, 70% of our birds are migratory, right? So when we think about bird conservation, the vast majority of it is migratory bird conservation. There are a few exceptions, right? Things like grouse, right? Greater prairie chicken, some of those sorts of things that are not prone to migration, but most of ours are migrate. And interesting, not everybody might know this, is that most of the birds that migrate, they migrate at night. And that's important because that's going to influence why your backyards are important to birds. Let me see if I can connect the dots there, okay? Now, why they migrate at night is a different question. We could get into that. We don't, there are kind of lots of different reasons for it, but there's probably less wind, cooler temperatures, fewer predators, lots and lots of factors. But let's just say that with the exception of raptors and waterfowl, raptors and waterfowl like to migrate during the day. Almost all the rest of the birds would rather be flying in the middle of the night. So what that means is that how do they get around, right? If you're getting around in the night, what do? You flip on the lights on your car, right? So that you can see. Well, they don't do that. They do something different. And actually, before I get to that, this is kind of fun. It's another fun website to waste time on. If you haven't ever discovered it, go to Birdcast. And Birdcast is a website run by a group of scientists that use weather radar to study and predict bird migration patterns, right? So you can go into Birdcast and say, all right, I live, here's my zip code and here's what day it is. And they'll give you a real-time estimation of how many birds are flying over your state that night, right? So here's a screenshot from 2022 in the night right in the middle, heart of fall migration. And we had 272 million birds flying over Minnesota in one night. That's a lot of birds, right? So we get hundreds of millions of birds flying over Minnesota in the spring and the fall every year. Remember, we got billions of birds in North America, about 9 billion. We used to have 12 billion. Now we've got about 9 billion birds. So hundreds of millions of birds flying over Minnesota. We're on the Mississippi River migratory flyway. They're heading up into the boreal forest of Canada. So we are an important place for migratory birds. And that we're an especially important place for migratory birds. Okay, so we know that this is happening. We also know how they do this. Now, how do we know this is a different, again, sort of fun science. It's like creativity and science overlap, right? So people have actually taken birds and put them in cages and then put them in a planetarium and then project the night sky on the planetarium, but flip it so it's in the exact opposite direction of it normally is. And then the birds wake up in the morning and fly in the wrong direction, right? So we know from actually lots of other experiments, we know they orient by the stars and the moon. So how they do that, is sort of a guess. We've got ideas. So that they're paying attention. So that number one, we know they don't really like to migrate when it's stormy and cloudy and they can't see the stars. But that's probably as much for wind and just unpredictability as anything else. But they're usually migrating at night, usually migrating on clear nights, and that they use the stars to orient. But that also means, in a way that's kind of unfortunate for them, that they are attracted to light in a way that's just, it's innate to birds. They don't have to learn it. It's just how they are. So these nocturnally migrating birds are attracted to light, right? And here's what our cities look like at night, right? We've got light coming from all over the place. Now, I grew up in the West. I lived in Southern Idaho. My grandparents lived in San Diego, California. So we would drive a couple times a year. And if you've ever driven through Nevada at night, you can see Las Vegas from 50 miles away. It's just glowing, right? There's just so much light. And Minneapolis is like that, and Chicago's like that, and all these urban centers are like that. We have lights, we've got our city lights, we've got our lights in our buildings, we've got lights in and so birds are attracted to our cities because we basically flip on a magnet every night during migration. They see those lights and it just draws them in. It's irresistible to them. And so this is why one of Audubon's conservation strategies is what's called the Lights Out campaign. It says during spring and fall migration, not as important in the summer and the winter, but during spring and fall, if you've got lights that are on and you don't need to have them on, please just turn them off, right? Turn off those lights. It's going to save you money. It's going to save, energy and carbon. And oh, by the way, it's going to hopefully decrease the number of birds that are drawn into our cities. Sometimes causes collisions, but even if it doesn't cause collisions, it draws them into our cities, and our cities essentially become magnets, right? And here's another interesting, very recent component of science. So we know that these lights are changing the migratory pathways of birds, right? Artificial light at night is a top predictor of bird migration stopover density, right? So where do you find migrant birds? Is it where the habitat is good or where the light is bright? Where the light is bright, okay? Are we starting to see why your backyard is very, very important to migratory birds? I'm glad you're getting it, right? So again, I bet you don't have, state threatened birds breeding in your yard in June and July, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're there in the month of May, because our well-lit landscape is a magnet for them, okay? So our urban centers are migrant traps. This isn't a desirable thing. I wish it wasn't this way. They would be better off if they landed out in the patches of continuous forest, but we just know this is the case. And so because it's the case, and because we haven't really solved the artificial light at night problem, now we say, all right, if we're attracting them, let's make sure that when they're here, they've got food, they've got shelter, they've got water, they've got habitat so that they can rest and refuel, right? These migrations, if you they fly about 200, 300 miles in a single night, and then they stop for 3 or 4 days and they refuel, right? So they fatten up and then they wait for the weather to be good again, and then they fly another 200 miles and then they stop and fatten up. So we call that migratory stopover. So it's hop, skip, and a jump, right? They fly 200 miles, stop for 3 days, refuel, fly 200 miles, stop 3 days, refuel, keep doing that until they get to their breeding grounds, and then they're there for the summer, okay? So these urban centers then are migrant traps, and so this brings us back to our backyards, right? Okay, so we need to provide what birds need when they are migrating. And that, again, is a challenge because what they need is, again, shelter, food, and water. And food is not really sunflower seeds and bird feeders, okay? Bird feeders are fine. There's no harm done as long as you keep them clean and whatnot. But most birds just don't eat bird seed, right? What do you see in your backyard? It's chickadees and cardinals and a few other birds. What do you see at your bird feeder? Squirrels, yeah. Goldfinches, yes, goldfinches like to eat seeds, but most birds don't eat seeds, they eat insects, right? So unless you've got a feeder of mealworms, which maybe not a terrible idea, but whatever, most of us don't do that. most of our feeders don't really help. Birds are looking for insects, and this is where we're going to start to get into the story about why native plants are important, because most people that are not thinking about birds, they're just, they want an immaculate lawn and whatnot. They're usually going for Kentucky bluegrass and maybe, who knows what trees they're planting. So we're going to be talking for the rest of the night about strategies, right? What can we do? And it's going to be this story that, again, this is where I'm going to be a broken record talking about the importance of native plants, right? So if we want birds to have habitat starts by recognizing that what shelter looks like, where food comes from, and this is kind of the opposite of habitat, right? This is a monoculture, single species, relatively little in the way of insects, maybe a few worms out there for a robin. Maybe a goldfinch would find one of those trees appealing, but not much going on there for most of our birds of conservation concern. And so when we think about habitat, we want it to look more like nature, right? That's kind of a loaded term when we say nature, but native plants, right? So trees that we find out in the woods, for wildflowers and grasses and forbs that we find out in the woods, shrubs that we find out in the woods. That's what the birds are accustomed to. That's what's going to be shelter for them, and that's what's going to have the insects that they want to eat. So native plants are the emphasis. When people say, what can we do? Our first response at Audubon is almost always just plant native plants in your yard, and that's going to benefit birds along with a whole suite of other things, right? So let's just start to go through some of the benefits, right? They use less water and fewer pesticides. And I'm going to make some generalizations here. Some of you might say, I don't know if that's always been my experience, but generally speaking, they should use less water because they are native to this area. So they are adapted to the climate that we have, right? So they're used to Minnesota's climate. And so once they get established, at least, they shouldn't require a lot of supplemental water. They shouldn't be tolerant of the local pests unless we have non-native pests, which we sometimes do. They should reduce time and effort spent on maintenance. Now, some of you are like, well, that's too bad, because yard maintenance is basically my favorite thing to do, right? It's gardening is what, and so it doesn't mean you can't keep tinkering, but for some people that's appealing to think that maybe there's a little bit less yard maintenance required. For birds, they're great because they provide food. Now, sometimes, and I'll sort of get to this, that means, nuts and fruits and seeds, nectar, that's all great. But most of our emphasis is really going to be on insects, because that's what so many birds are eating, and where our sort of the crux of the urban bird conservation is. I don't know if you can see this very well. The next one says support pollinating insects, and this is one of those sort of funny things, right? That ornithologists love insects, and we love entomologists. Entomologists don't always love ornithologists that much. They're like, your things just want to eat our things, right? And that's not very nice. And we're like, well, I don't know. Yeah, so we want lots of insects because the insects are what so many birds eat. And so when we are supporting pollinators, birds are going to benefit from that as well. They, in many cases, absorb and store carbon. Non-native plants can do that as well. In some cases, especially when we're looking at prairie plants, they will have more extensive root systems and stuff. But I'm not going to say that native plants always store more carbon, but it is a benefit that both of them can do that. They're beautiful, right? Some people are like, oh, native plants don't have as many flowers or blooms. That's hogwash. There's plenty of beauty in there if you plant the right things, and sometimes you have to train your eye to what's true beauty is, I'll argue, right? So I mean, we don't always need to have, flower heads the size of our heads. And then again, they will attract more birds and benefit more birds. And that's going to happen for a number of reasons. Again, they do provide food in lots of different forms, right? And so some of our plants do provide seeds, right? And you've got coneflowers, and that every year you're going to have goldfinches and maybe pine siskins, and they're going to hang off those coneflowers and pick seeds out of them, and that's just delightful to watch. If you're a hummingbird nut, that's great, plant columbines and whatnot, and they'll take advantage of that nectar. Some of you may know in Minnesota, we're kind of deprived of hummingbird diversity. If you see a hummingbird in Minnesota, you don't even need to look at it to know what species it is, because we only have one species. In Idaho, where I grew up, we had 4 species. You go down to Arizona, they've got more than a dozen species. Go down to Ecuador, they've got dozens of species, right? So hummingbird diversity is not equally distributed. Or go to Europe, they have none. So, hummingbirds are only in the Western Hemisphere, interestingly, right? So all kinds of interesting food there. But again, my emphasis is on insects, because insects are the preferred food source of most birds, especially during the breeding season, because insects are what most birds feed their chicks. Think about a hummingbird. Hummingbirds do not feed their chicks nectar. They feed their chicks insects. You can't grow a hummingbird off of nectar. Got to have some protein, right? So birds, with the exception of birds that are feeding their chicks meat, like hawks and falcons, the vast majority of them are feeding insects or turtles, or there are a few exceptions. So that gets to the question of, how do you grow insects? And the most effective way to do that, again, is to plant native plants. And this is where, how many of you know Doug Tallamy? You read his, yeah, that was my guess, right? That's why I didn't request a Doug Tallamy book, because I'm like, I know everyone's got that one and everybody else. So these are the numbers that are going to look familiar to you, right? If you plant a white oak native to Minnesota, and how many of you saw, you get the Star Tribune, you saw in the newspaper this morning, what timing, right? On the front page of the newspaper this morning, bottom of the front page, a story about Doug Tallamy and his work, which is not a new story, it's old news, but they've done a more recent analysis of the idea of keystone plants by region in North America, right? So you can go through and say, all right, I want, we all know the oaks are good. What about a keystone shrub, or what about a keystone, forb, or wildflower, or whatever? What are the plants that are going to have the most insects and attract the most biodiversity? But in Minnesota, if we look at, here's 2 different deciduous trees, we could plant a white oak versus a ginkgo, both beautiful trees, both have structure that a bird might be attracted to, but one of them is going to be a smorgasbord of food, and the other one much less so. Right, and quite remarkable. And this again is the very highest and one of the very lowest, but still pretty staggering, right? That you've got very few native insects that can make use of a ginkgo, and very, very many.
Is it native?
It's not native. No, it's native to China. So ancient past, we had ginkgos in North America in the fossil record, but the modern ginkgo, there's only one species, and it's native to Asia. But yeah, good question. And actually, Tallamy has, if you haven't read it, Tallamy also has a book on just oaks, which is another fun one to read, about why is it that oaks have so many more native insects that are living on them than others do, and that's an interesting story to unravel as well. So that's the first message, right? Just start by planting natives. And in this newspaper article this morning, we get the Star Tribune as well. He says you can plant a garden of all native plants that is just as devoid of insects as a garden of non-native plants, right? So native's better than non-native, but not all natives are equally efficient at growing caterpillars. And so that's kind of what he's getting at. He's like, all right, we got the message across that natives are desirable, but we find that some natives are a little more effective than others if producing wild food for, biodiversity is your goal. Right? So insects, and part of the reason for that is that most insects are just as picky as the birds are, right? We said birds are picky about their habitat. Insects are particular as well. And we know that that's not true of all insects, but many insects are habitat or are species specific. That's true, as true in Minnesota as it is in, in Ecuador in the tropics. And so, there are, most of the caterpillars only will eat one form of plant or maybe one family of plant. And so if you have, and some people ask me this too, should I just plant, a yard full of oaks? And I actually say, that's not a terrible thing to do, but even better would be, some other native trees, because you're going to have, certain types of insects growing in oaks, certain type of insects growing in willows, certain types in black cherries. And so the more, the more diverse trees, you're going to have more diverse food for birds as well. And so again, what we find is that insects are important for fuel, for migrants. They're also important for fuel for baby birds. Sure, sort of nice to look at. I don't know. They're cute, right? If you appreciate a certain thing. I spent, some time in graduate school looking at baby birds through a mirror, and so you can kind of get to love them, even though they're a little bit they look a little like aliens. But for a chickadee, right, if you've got a clutch of 4 chicks, you need thousands of caterpillars in order for that 2.5 week intense period after the eggs hatch before those chicks fly out of your nest. So this is what we need in order to keep bird populations stable and thriving and healthy, is lots of native plants to provide those insects. So again, we've got a good sense for what those species are. And one interesting note here, right, is that there's a non-native on there, right?
Yeah.
Apple trees are not native to Minnesota. We've got a lot of them, right? We cultivate them. University of Minnesota does a great job of connecting us to apples, but they host a lot of insects. I don't know if we brought them with them and they've naturalized here. I don't really know the story there, but I do find that interesting that apples are good for diversity, even though they're not a native tree in Minnesota. At least they're native to Central Asia, Kazakhstan area. We've answered that question of what you can do. It's plant native plants and plant the native plants that contain more species of insects. But let's get into a few more details. If you are interested in which native plants, Audubon has a great resource, Plants for Birds. If you go to the Audubon website or just Google Audubon Plants for Birds, there you can enter your zip code, as long as you're willing to surrender your email address, and you'll get emails from Audubon. This is our secret way of getting your email address. Enter your email address and your zip code, and then it will give you a list of native plants that you can select from that are going to be good for birds, right? So, and it's got, it narrows shade or partial shade or full sun, and trees and shrubs and forbs and whatnot. So it's a pretty great resource. I think this is what I use, and I'm not a plant expert. John knows. He asked me questions, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm pretty good with birds, but when it comes to like identifying asters and grasses and stuff, many of my people that work for me are infinitely better at it than I am. But this is a great place to start. I'm just like, what should I plant? Well, depends on where you are, and depends on what kind of soil you have and what kind of sun you have. This is a great resource that can give you some hints about what to plant. Again, here's just an example of sort of what you'll get. If I entered my input, it gives you 97 different species to choose from, lots of great resources there. So one important thing to think about that is pretty specific to birds is thinking about structure. Okay, so birds are very particular to structure, and something we've studied with grassland birds is that they are more attracted to a grassland with non-native grasses with the structure that they want than a grassland with native grasses that doesn't have the structure that they want, right? So that means they're looking for sort of size and shape, and they select that before they say, oh, are the things that I like to eat here. And we, unfortunately, we call that an ecological sink, right? That we attract them to a place that looks right to them and they get there and there might not be very much for them to eat there. But structure is very important. And so we want to usually think about that in sort of three different ways. We call it the overstory, the understory, and the mid-story or the mid-canopy, right? A lot of forest birds are going to be very interested in what types of trees, how big and old the trees are, or how young the trees are. One thing that's quite interesting, actually, is that if you think about forests, and you think about what's desirable for conservation, the first thing that comes to mind for both of us is what are we lacking? Old growth forest, right? We want more old growth forest. And that's true. We do want more old growth forests. Most of our forests in Minnesota are second growth. We've cut down most of the really ancient trees. But interestingly, a lot of the birds that are showing some alarming declines are birds that are dependent on young forests, because most of our forests are middle age. We don't have very much old growth. We also don't have very much young forest because we cut down all the forests in the same timeline, and then we replanted all those forests in the same timeline. And so now we have a bunch of forests that are even aged, where all the trees are about the same age. And that's not really good for very many birds either, especially if it's too dense. And so if you look at, I showed earlier, eastern towhee, if you're familiar with eastern towhee, that's a bird that just likes shrubs and edgy habitats, which you would think we have an abundance of, but they're not doing very well. So sorry. What?
So is the structure, something that they use as defendable space? Like I think of the grasslands. And if I don't have a queen of the meadow to light up on so I can look around, then I'm getting pounced on and dying.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'd rather not eat and stay alive than.
Kind of,
eat and
yeah.
die.
Yeah. I mean, structure is their first priority. If it's they're not going to go somewhere with food, but the structure is just all wrong for them. They're very particular about that. And we've gotten to a point now where we've got a pretty good sense of what they're looking for. And actually, this is, I wouldn't even think to put this up here, but I should have. We just published about 2 weeks ago a brand new resource, not just we, not Audubon, but a conglomeration of partners in Minnesota called Forestry for Minnesota Birds. Right. So it's all about how to manage forests for birds. It's mostly kind of targeted at like land managers and foresters that are doing, large scale forest management. There's really great resources in there for you. So if you Google the Forest Guild website is where it's being hosted, but Forestry for Minnesota Birds, you should be able to find that pretty easily. And it's got great resources in there. So one of the bird species that we work a lot on and for Audubon upper Mississippi River is the cerulean warbler. Cerulean warblers nest in bottomland forests along Mississippi River and the Minnesota River and St. Croix River. And they it's quite particular, right? It's like they want old big trees, but they also want gaps in the canopy. They don't want continuous old big trees. They want old big trees with about 85% canopy coverage, right? So if it's 100% canopy coverage, wrong structure. They won't use it. So you got to cut down a couple of trees and then they show up, right? So they're picky. Lots of birds like that are very particular. So planning your yard with this in mind, say, well, what are the birds that I want, and do I have habitats that are going to kind of work for a whole bunch of them? And so, having a few shrubs mixed in with your trees, having sort of those feathered edges instead of having a really hard edge where your lawn, if you have a lawn, comes right up to your forest. Those things will help a little bit. So structure can be really important for attracting birds. And if you think about this is just sort of an overgeneralization, but helpful. But if they lack vegetative diversity, they're going to lack bird diversity also, right? So you might have a habitat that's really suitable to one species, but if it's only one species, that might be all you get. And that's not a terrible thing. Again, if you've got a small yard, then sometimes that's just what you get. But if you've got space, if you've got lots of land, think about having, some areas with high, and sorry, I'm using canopy cover. I don't know so canopy cover just means like, if you're in the forest and you look up, do you see sky or do you see trees? right? So if you look up and you see trees, that means you've got high canopy cover. And if you look up and you see sky, that means you've got gaps in the canopy, the forest, the tree, the leaf canopy. All right, leaf litter is, a lot of us have the instinct to always be cleaning up our leaves, and that's okay. But a lot of insects love to just grow and thrive in what looks messy to some people, the leaf litter on the floor of your woods or your yard. So if you can tolerate it, or I think what most of us do is we've got certain parts of the yard where we pile leaves, and I'll just use the leaves as compost, and other parts of my yard where I am going to rake them up, and I don't want the leaves, over the other areas. But if you can find some areas where with leaf litter, little ground, foraging birds like dark-eyed juncos will be happy to find some things there to eat. This is kind of fun. In graduate school, I spent way too much time and effort thinking about cavity nesting birds. And so we think of maybe bluebirds, that we put houses up for, but we've got over 30 species in Minnesota that are dependent on cavities for their nests. And so by putting up a birdhouse, right? Where did those birds nest before birdhouses existed, right? They were dependent on woodpeckers primarily to create cavities for them. Sometimes they use natural tree cavities. Sometimes they use, chickadees and nuthatches. If it's a really rotten tree, can excavate their own cavity. But you've got whole groups of birds and mammals and reptiles and insects that also benefit, bats that really thrive off those cavities. So you can do that in two ways. You can put up a birdhouse, which is a decent option. A lot of birds won't use birdhouses, but a lot of birds will. But if you've got a suitable place where it's safe and you've got dead trees, just leave those dead trees there, right? We call them snags in forestry parlance. And so let those snags just, if they're not putting anybody at risk, let those snags stay up, and chances are a woodpecker will come and excavate in them at some point. And then that woodpecker nest will then be reused by lots of other ducks and songbirds and flying squirrel. Actually, flying squirrels love woodpecker cavities. That's kind of fun. Most of you probably have flying squirrels in your yard, whether you know it or not. They're more common than people realize, but they're extremely nocturnal. So you won't see them even at dawn and dusk very often. They're just really only out in the middle of the night, but they're all over in the suburbs.
What about that birdhouse
Yeah, that's not a great birdhouse. I just kind of like that picture. This is kind of what not to do, right? Yeah, and this is sometimes what happens. We put them up and then they deteriorate, and
I got one.
and they're hard to keep up with. That's right. They're hard to keep up with, but yeah, they're kind of pretty too. That one's for some reason I kind of like that picture. It's looks like a nice place. When you put a bird bath up, that's probably not what you're hoping to attract. Most people gripe about the Cooper's hawks and the sharp-shinned hawks and things that show up and chase all their songbirds off. But water is just a great way to attract birds. Most birds aren't desperate for water. They get a lot of their water from the food they eat. We call it metabolic water. If you study physiology, when you eat food, your body turns some of that into water, but they will take advantage of it if they get a chance to, and they do like to bathe in it. So if you've got a water source, great. We all know that with mosquitoes and things, you want to like freshen that water up every couple of days, and it can just get kind of gross too. And sometimes birds are contributing to that grossness.
If you have a lake or a swamp, like within a block,
Yeah.
is it just sort of pointless to, put your money into a new plant instead of bothering to put up a water feature?
Yeah, probably. It depends on how far away it is, right? Because at least during the breeding season, birds are territorial. So if that pond or swamp isn't within their territory, they're not going to use it, because to go get a drink or take a bath means risking invading somebody else's territory and getting harassed. So yeah, it depends on how close you are to that water body. But generally speaking, yeah, if you've got water close by, then it's probably not a real huge value add. Again, feeders are great. People ask me all the time about feeders. Feeders don't cause much harm. They also don't really help many. There are very few species of conservation concern, at least if you're interested in rare birds and helping rare birds, very few of them are likely to show up at feeders. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, especially up in northern Minnesota. If you've got an opportunity to feed evening grosbeak, they like feeders, and red poles, some of those crossbills and whatnot. But for the most part, in the Twin Cities, I think feeders are great. I've got feeders at my house. I love seeing the birds come to them. My family likes seeing the birds come to them. The only thing we say is keep them relatively clean. They can spread disease if you're not cleaning them occasionally. With the avian flu outbreak, especially 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when it was brand kind of new, there was a lot of concern. And some of you might recall the Raptor Center advocated that people do take down their feeders, mostly just out of precaution. In hindsight, we now know that in the same way that COVID affected us differently, right? That COVID affected people that were a little older and didn't really cause as many problems for people that were younger. Avian flu is similar. It causes problems for some types of birds, but not all. So songbirds aren't really affected by it that much. We're in very few songbirds that have died from avian flu, but things like birds of prey and waterfowl and shorebirds have been hit very hard by avian flu. So we don't need to worry about bird feeders attracting birds and spreading avian flu, but it can spread something called avian pox, which can be bad for birds that they can get from feeders that aren't being cleaned regularly.
Do blue jays get avian flu?
They could, yeah. So the corvid family is more prone to avian flu than other songbirds. So crows are technically songbirds. They're in the songbird family, but yeah, corvids more prone to avian flu. Also more prone to West Nile virus when that was a big concern a few years back. So for whatever reason, as smart and wily as they are, apparently their immune system is not as robust as some others. This is kind of a tricky one, right? So when I started at Audubon, he said, you can talk about cats all you want, but it won't move the needle. We've been encouraging people to keep their cats indoors for decades, and most people still let their cats out. So I know these numbers are much too small for you to read, but this is bird declines, right? So this is collisions with buildings, this is collisions with automobiles, this is power lines, this is cats, right? Cats kill of human caused or human influenced bird mortality. Cats are number one, right? They kill more birds. Yeah.
In scale, where would raptors be?
Raptors?
Yes.
Good question. I don't know. We could probably do some rough math and figure out like what's the population size of bird eating raptors in North America and how many birds do they need to eat in a year, come up with a number. I think most of us are not concerned about that because raptors are native, and so that's a healthy thing for raptors to be eating native birds, and these are things that are under our control, right? And so if raptors were to stop eating birds, then those raptors would become rare and decline, and we wouldn't want that either. So at least I'm comfortable with sharp-chin hawks picking off a goldfinch every now and then, but yeah.
Just on that, it looks like there's a blue next to the green or something like that on the cat one. What is the difference?
Yes, so the green is the United States and blue is Canada. Yep, so this is sort of all of North America, north of the Mexican.
Saying that the Canadians keep their cats in more than you.
Well, and there just probably are fewer cats in Canada, fewer people in Canada, therefore fewer cats. And maybe the colder climate are kept indoors more. I don't really know if that's the case, but my
We can learn their habits.
yeah, maybe. My hunch is it's just that there are fewer people, therefore fewer cats is probably a bigger driver there, but I'm not entirely sure. That's a great question.
States that laws against cats being loose.
I don't think so. Well, there may be. I'm not aware. It's not very. They would be challenging to enforce. I'm sure there might be some, you know, cities and towns that have laws about that, but I think there would be relatively few. My hunch is that they would say that'd be very expensive and difficult to enforce and not the best use of their money. But
The other negative is, though they passed laws now, that you can't have cats declawed,
oh, really?
which is an advantage to the cats.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very, very rarely the cats catch them in the mouth. It's the claws.
Right, with the claws. Interesting. Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Big PR campaign that changed public opinion about
Decline.
cats being outside or cats being inside.
Oh, okay.
I mean, because that line is because of cats being allowed to go out
Yep.
to kill mice and voles.
Yeah.
Oh, they don't kill any
Yeah.
birds.
And there are, I will say, I know this is there's debate about this. Not if they kill birds, but what they're killing, right? They're killing probably chickadees and juncos and
Hmm.
things that are not super common because they're killing birds in backyards where, you know, species that are particular about habitat conditions are unlikely to be.
But what about the feral cats that are all over?
Yes, yeah. So I'm definitely
Yeah, that would be-
for keeping cats indoors, but I know that there are a few and far between, a few ornithologists that are like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But I think it's probably a pretty significant concern. Anyhow, yes, keep your
My
cats
story
indoors.
has been that I used to have Russian. A couple of feral cats showed up and I haven't seen a Russian.
And they're gone. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yep.
So, they're
That
not
would
just.
surprise me. Right. Yes. Right. Yep. Yep. Especially if you've got good habitat that's got some thrushes in it. Then. Yeah. So another sort of somewhat complex topic is the issue of windows, right? I imagine all of you have had that terrible experience of hearing the thud against your window. Oh gosh, a bird just flew into my window. That happens for a couple of different reasons, but aside from cats, collisions with buildings is the second largest cause of sort of human influenced bird deaths. And people often ask us, like, well, what about this? What about that? And like wind turbines is a common one. And wind turbines do kill a lot of birds. And I think that we could do much better jobs, especially with siding and making sure that wind turbines aren't in big migratory pathways. But if you compare the mortality estimates with wind turbines with other things, should we do something about it? Yes, we should. But is it having an impact on the scale of, things like windows? Probably not. Right. So let's talk about why.
Is it species dependent though?
Uh,
There's some species that.
There are some species that are more prone to it than others. Yeah. In a way that we don't really understand why that is. But yeah, like ovenbirds are really prone to hitting windows for whatever reason. But yeah.
I mean, winter.
Wind turbine. Yes, you're right. Yeah. And for a lot of wind turbines, and it's hard to say because there's probably bias there. When people are doing bird surveys for wind turbine mortality, they're finding big, like birds of prey. But if a songbird gets hit, the probability of it being found is much lower, right? And so there's a lot of debate about how much mortality there is. Some of both, yeah. But if the migration's at night, yeah, during migration, absolutely.
But this takes on wind turbine. Actually, they're taking the area from smaller windows than they're using them. And so the statistics are much lower than the actual count.
There's probably some truth to that. Yeah, I mean, we can't know for certain. A lot of this is modeled, so it's not just how many birds have we found dead, but how many birds did we find dead if we did a really intensive study and then compare that with, all the turbines that exist in the country and a little bit about migratory pathways. So I don't think these are perfectly accurate. I think this is true for all of these. None of these numbers come from individual birds found. It's all from, estimates of models from what, like doing an intensive study and then extrapolating that. So, yeah.
Can you wrap it up on 5 minutes?
Oh, gosh, yes, sorry, I'm too, sorry. I get too chatty. So let's talk about this issue really quickly. And this is very recent. Last year, there was 992, if I remember right, all birds died in a single night in Chicago of a mass mortality event. So this can be pretty intense. So what's causing this? Most of it is caused by reflection. It's by planting trees and shrubs in front of windows. That's the problem. So when the bird sees this, they think a forest, right? They can't tell the difference. So when we put up that what we call fritted glass, or putting up the decals that put the little dots on the windows, that's just so that the birds can say, oh, that's a solid surface. That's not a reflection. So one thing we do, which is somewhat controversial, is we say, please don't plant plants in front of windows. And in some cases, there's been debates, we say, well, let's move those plants away from windows. We're like, no, we don't want to reduce plants at all. I'm like, well, attracting birds to those areas can be pretty detrimental. So again, not everybody agrees on that, but we do know that a lot of this window collision is a function of them not being able to make a distinction between the trees and the trees that are reflected in the window. And so the window issue is complex because you got nighttime light coming through the windows, attracting birds, and you got daytime plants being reflected in the windows, which is a different issue. So the windows can cause problems in two different ways, right? So for that reason, right, turn your lights off at night and put the decals on your windows, or don't put plants in front of your windows to avoid that problem of collisions. Okay, so we're nearly done here. This is a list of, not exhaustive, but some just quite simple things that you can do to make your yard a bird-friendly yard. And again, probably not going to attract cerulean warblers to nest in your yard. I wish they would. But during migration, go out into your yard in the next 4 weeks. The month of May is the best month of the year, in my opinion, right? These birds, new birds showing up every day. Migration is such a delight. And that's when you will see some pretty spectacular, colorful little gems dripping off the branches of the plants in your yard. And so by planting native plants and following many of these suggestions, you can make sure that the birds that find your yard are benefiting from what you've produced. So again, thank you for your time. Lots of great resources out there. This is the book I recommended because it's probably not as familiar as Doug Talame is to almost everybody I've found now. Welcome to Suburbia is written by John Marsliff, who's an ornithologist at the University of Washington, who's also a really great writer, interesting guy. I think that might be my last slide, or maybe we've got one last parting bit of information. Yes.
I would suggest the Merlin.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, if you're hearing birds and you want to know what it is, for years, like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a way to do that? We do now, and it's free and it works great. So if you haven't used the Merlin app, it's free. It's from the Cornell University. It works. It's slick and easy, and it's really fun. So some of you probably know your birds' songs, but if you don't, this is going to help you learn them, or just be aware of what birds are in your yard. Yeah, young lady.
There's like certain
of itself is like endangered.
It's-
It's a big number.
100 is a pretty big number, but it's a really good question, and it's kind of complex. But one thing we found is that sometimes there are events that happen where a whole bunch of animals die at the same time. And so what we found is that a lot of the animals that have gone extinct, it's like their population gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then once they get small to down to like 100, then something like a wildfire comes through and all 100 of them die at the same time. And so there's a couple of the extinctions in North America have had stories like that, where populations were pretty small, but not down to like 1 or 2. And then many of them all died together. There's also, we studied genetics, and we find that if you have a small population, that the gene pool for that group is not going to be very healthy. And so we would like big populations because you get healthier genetics for them to work with also. Great question. That's a really good question.
Are the fox sparrows on your list of rare?
No, they're doing okay. I mean, I think there some sort of gradual declines, but they're doing okay.
I mean, I've seen fox sparrows every spring for the last 10.
Okay. Yep.
I don't see them now. I mean, things have already moved further north.
Yeah. Yep. They kind of come through a little bit
This would be
early.
The first migrants I see.
Yes. Yeah. They're pretty early migrants with yellow rumps and others. Yep. Yes. Oh gosh. So there's a couple of lists kept by different groups. The DNR has actually, it's kind of confusing, but 4 different levels of rare species. So we have the state endangered, state threatened, and then state special concern species, right? And those are designated by legislature. And then the non-game program also has what are called species of greatest conservation need. And that includes all the birds that are on the other 3 lists, plus a little bit more extensive. So any bird with like just a steady gradual population decline, or maybe just a very low population in general. And there's about, gosh, maybe about 40 or 50 birds on that list of species of greatest conservation need. But it includes a bunch of grassland birds. Like I said, grassland birds are really struggling. So you've got things like Henslow's sparrow and greater prairie chicken and upland sandpiper, a few birds of prey, red-shouldered hawk, lots and lots of songbirds. So I don't know.
First, statistic that 90% of what was once prairie, so that it's gone.
More than that, at least of the untouched prairie, of the uncultivated prairie, it's about 98.7% has all been plowed at one point. Now, a lot of that's been restored, some of that's been restored now, so it's, a good healthy prairie. But for the true native prairie that's never been plowed, we've lost 98%.
Cultivar trees that are put in neighborhoods. Are a lot of these, are a lot of those cultivars insect resistant? Or were they cultivated just for appearance?
That's a very good question. I know a little bit about that, and I'll say that I do think some of those cultivars have lower insect diversity than do the natives, but I don't know if that's universally true. So I've never like really dug into the science on that. So I'm not sure. I don't want to say that with confidence. Yes,
So many
right.
people plant.
Yep, absolutely.
Comment on that, I mean, this arguing native land, we are not trying to be insect resistant, we are trying to be
Insect friendly, right? Yes. There's that tension. Yeah.
That's a conversation with.
Yeah.
Neighborhood. Between. Suburbs or communities that are doing a good job of being, or being made plants. I saw that like Minneapolis is on board with lights out, but I gotta say, I live in Shoreview. No one on my block gets what I'm doing, despite signage.
Right.
Like, happy to have a conversation.
Yeah.
They're not interested, they can't wait to pull and again. That's all on the recorder.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say.
Like, if there's somebody you think, hey, I go to.
Right.
You know.
Yep. So a gross simplification, there's a program called Bird City where city ordinances are generally more bird friendly. And so cities that want to become a bird friendly city sort of have to, follow a certain percentage of those. And so if you look up bird cities in Minnesota, that can kind of give you some sense of some cities that are a little bit more intentional about trying to be bird friendly with their practices.
Do you know of any here?
Yeah, I believe Minneapolis is bird friendly. I know Stillwater is, Winona, Rochester, a few other cities have intentionally tried to take on some of those taxes. Yeah. And I apologize for being too verbose. I'm not watching my watch. I should have paid closer attention, but,
It's rules building, it's not.
okay. So kick us off. Yeah. Well. Thank
you very much.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I appreciate being here. Thanks for the invitation.
Do you know what birds that is?
Let's